Did you know that one mistake could cost millions of lives? In this story, the USA decided the fate of the war in just a few days. If you're interested in the truth about World War II, subscribe and hit the like button. There are many shocking facts ahead. January 5th, 1943. The night air over the Kula Gulf in the Solomon Islands pulsed with tension. Imagine standing on the deck of the cruiser USS Helena, your hands gripping cold steel as the sea shudders beneath the fury of battle. Lieutenant Red Cochran leaned into the fire control director, eyes locked on 4 enemy shapes slicing through the sky. HED-3A dive bombers, the deadly Japanese VLs. Moments earlier, they had hammered the New Zealand cruiser Achilles and were now wheeling away with that eerie clockwork precision so characteristic of Imperial Navy pilots. But this time, something unseen waited for them. Cochran's guns weren't firing ordinary shells. Inside each was a secret, a fragment of innovation that would rewrite the very geometry of aerial combat. 2 thunderous salvos erupted from Helena's aft 5-inch guns. A heartbeat later, one of the retreating valves blossomed into fire, not struck directly, but shredded by invisible steel teeth from a shell that had exploded 30 feet away. The Japanese pilot never saw his killer. His commanders would never understand what happened, nor would the Japanese High Command, not for the rest of the war. That night, history changed, quietly, decisively. It was the first combat kill by a device that historians would later rank beside radar and the atomic bomb in its strategic impact. The proximity fuse, known innocuously as the variable time or VT fuse, had just made its debut in the Pacific. Over the next 2.5 years, this invention would upend Japanese aerial tactics, cripple their offensive potential, and save thousands of American lives. Yet this revolution was born not of brilliance, but of failure, of a stubborn, deadly problem that had haunted anti-aircraft gunners since the dawn of aerial warfare. Now picture another morning, December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor, Oahu. The sky screams with engines and flame. Japanese bombers dive through the tropical sun, their shadows darting across the harbor like hunting birds. American gun crews, desperate and unyielding, fight back with whatever remains operational. 5-inch naval guns roar from the decks of damaged ships, sending shells hurtling upward toward the attackers. Each projectile must be timed by hand, a sailor twisting a wrench against a tiny clockwork fuse, trying to guess the exact second his shell will meet a plane moving more than 300 miles per hour. Under fire, under chaos, it's a cruel equation. Too early, and the shell bursts in empty sky. Too late, and it explodes uselessly behind the target. Many never detonate at all. Others, still armed, plunge back to Earth. 9 miles away in Honolulu, the consequences are horrifying. 55-pound shells tear through rooftops, crash into streets, rip through buildings. At the Cherry Blossom restaurant, the Hirosaki family, Father Jitsuo, sons Jackie and Robert, daughter Shirley and nephew George, die instantly, along with 7 young men sharing their breakfast. Nearby, a shell slams into a small home, killing 3-month-old Janet Yumiko Ota, her mother, and her aunt, the youngest victims of the day. By the time the smoke clears over Pearl Harbor, 68 civilians are dead. 32 of them were killed not by Japanese bombs, but by American shells falling on their own city, a grim testimony to the tragic limits of existing technology. The mathematics of anti-aircraft defense were merciless. To destroy a moving target in the sky, gunners needed 3 perfect measurements: distance, altitude, and trajectory, all performed under fire against a plane darting through glare, smoke, and cloud at impossible speed. And so the question hung heavy in the air, one that would soon summon some of the greatest scientific minds of the century. How do you hit what you can barely see and never touch? Second, gunners needed to know altitude, an exact height estimate for a target that could peel up or plunge down without warning. Third, the fire control computers had to predict where that aircraft would be during the 15 to 30 seconds a shell took to climb to intercept. After those computations, a sailor still had to wind a tiny clockwork fuse by hand. The shell was rammed into the bore, the gun fired, and the little mechanism ticked away. Only if every single calculation was flawless, only if the plane did not change course or speed, and only if the mechanical fuse worked perfectly would the charge detonate close enough to matter. Even in the best of circumstances, the chance of destroying an aircraft was about 1 in 2,500 rounds. In the chaos of battle, with many targets twisting through curtain fire, the odds collapsed even further. This was not a problem newly born in 1941. It had been the shadow of gunnery since the First World War. Yet the gap between anti-aircraft technology and aircraft performance had widened into something like an abyss. In 1918, fighters flew at roughly 90 miles per hour beneath 15,000 feet. By 1940, fighters topped 400 miles per hour and operated above 30,000 feet. What once had been a manageable calculation became a near impossibility at high speed and altitude. The British discovered that harsh reality under the German dive bombers over Dunkirk. There were no easy fixes. Ships could not simply be fitted with endless extra guns. Magazines could not be made infinite to carry more shells. Improved fire control brought some advantage, but it could not erase the fundamental flaw. Time fuses demanded a perfect forecast of where a plane would be seconds hence. Then, in August 1940, an unlikely challenge found its way to an ionosphere physicist. At the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism, Carnegie Institution, Washington, D.C., Dr. Merle Anthony Tuve received a nearly impossible charge from the National Defense Research Committee. Tuve, a South Dakota native, educated at the University of Minnesota and Johns Hopkins, had spent his career probing the upper air with radio waves. In 1925, alongside Gregory Bright, he had helped invent methods to map the ionosphere by measuring radio wave reflections. That work, it turned out, was the kernel of what would become radar. So, when the committee asked whether radio physics could solve anti-aircraft fusing, Tuve immediately saw a thread of possibility. The British, through the Tizard mission, had already offered early findings. They believed a proximity fuse might be workable for rockets or bombs, but declared it impossible for artillery. Why? Because a 5-inch shell endures accelerations on the order of 20,000 GI when it is fired. Electronic gear of 1940, delicate vacuum tubes, simply could not survive that savage jolt. Tuve answered with a bold idea, a tiny radio transmitter and receiver compact enough to fit in the nose of a shell, no larger than a pint milk bottle. The transmitter would continuously radiate. As the shell neared a plane, the radio waves would bounce back. The reflected signal would be Doppler shifted. When that shift reached a preset threshold signaling proximity, an electrical circuit would close and fire the detonator. The concept reads like elegant simplicity, but in 1940, it seemed almost miraculous to execute. On 24 August 1940, Section T of the National Defense Research Committee was formed with Tuve at its head and a skeleton team set up in a Carnegie laboratory. Their first task was brutally practical. Identify every component a working fuse would need. They compiled a checklist of impossibilities: a radio transmitter operating at frequencies high enough to yield useful Doppler shifts, a receiver sensitive enough to pick up reflections from an aircraft hundreds of feet away, an electronic amplifier to raise that faint echo to detectable levels, a comparator circuit to detect the Doppler shift between transmitted and received waves, a power source capable of delivering the required voltage and current, a detonator reliably triggered by the electronic circuit, and safety interlocks to stop premature explosions. All of this had to be crammed into a space roughly 8 inches long and 2 inches in diameter. Each item on the list looked, at first glance, insurmountable. The enemy in this story was not a human opponent, but physics and materials. Vacuum tubes, the sole amplifying technology of the day, were fragile glass envelopes containing tiny filaments and electrodes. A standard radio tube might stand 6 inches tall and weigh several ounces. The sturdiest tubes made for mobile military radios were designed to withstand about 10 G of shock. The fuse would demand survival at 20,000 G. To picture that force, a 1-ounce tube under 20,000 G would, for the fraction of a second it rode down the barrel, behave as if it weighed 1,250 pounds. Forces such as those can, without exaggeration, disassemble solid steel. By October 1940, laboratories across America were receiving urgent appeals from the National Defense Research Committee. Western Electric and the Radio Corporation of America were summoned to invent miniaturized vacuum tubes, ruggedized for extreme acceleration. Sylvania set to work on special glass formulations. The task had moved from theory to an industrial sprint. If the fuse was to be anything but a pipe dream, industry would have to reshape its materials and methods to survive the gunner's brutal timetable. Can you feel the scale of that leap? From abstract Doppler equations to glass and metal that must not shatter under the weight of 20,000 gravities. The problem was as much metallurgy and manufacturing as it was physics. Raytheon entered the race next, experimenting with vacuum tubes that used planar electrodes, structures that spread the tremendous forces of acceleration more evenly across their surfaces. Early prototypes shattered instantly when fired, a cruel reminder that nature does not forgive fragile engineering. The solution would demand reinvention at every level, from glass chemistry to assembly technique. Engineers toughened the glass itself by adding compounds that strengthened its molecular bonds while preserving the airtight vacuum essential for function. Inside, they cushioned delicate parts with shock-absorbing materials. Electrodes were spot-welded into frameworks capable of surviving stresses that could rip apart solid steel. By spring 1941, after thousands of failures, a miracle of miniaturization emerged from the furnaces and benches of America's laboratories. Tubes less than 1 inch tall, light as a feather, yet strong enough to endure 20,000 G of acceleration. The dream had a heartbeat, but power, the lifeblood of any circuit, remained a nightmare. The fuse needed a source of electricity small enough to fit within the shell and rugged enough to survive launch. At the National Bureau of Standards, Harry Diamond and Wilbur Hinman conceived a breathtakingly clever answer: a liquid-activated battery sealed inside a glass tube. It lay dormant until the shell was fired. As the projectile spun, centrifugal force flung the electrolyte outward to meet tiny metal contacts embedded in the tube walls. The resultant chemical reaction produced current. The battery came alive only in flight. It was self-arming, self-sustaining, and inherently safe. May 6, 1941. Dahlgren Naval Proving Ground, Virginia. 6 prototypes built by the Bureau's team were fitted into aerial bombs and released over water. The transmitters hummed, receivers caught echoes from the sea below, circuits sensed proximity, and all 6 detonated precisely at their programmed altitude. Success. The concept was vindicated, yet everyone present knew that dropping bombs was child's play compared to hurling shells from a 5-inch gun. The next step would multiply the challenge 100-fold. By June 1941, Section T had swollen to more than 100 engineers, physicists, and ordnance experts. A disused automobile dealership in Silver Spring, Maryland, became their clandestine headquarters. Locals whispered about the mysterious men behind blackout curtains, perhaps spies, perhaps inventors. Officially, they were researching optical instruments. In truth, they were racing to forge a weapon that might change the fate of nations. Each day peeled back new layers of complexity. The antenna had to be small enough to fit inside the shell's nose, yet powerful enough to transmit and receive radio signals. Engineers designed a ring antenna encircling the fuse body. The transmitter needed to operate between 70 and 90 megahertz, stable and strong on just 3 tiny vacuum tubes. The receiver had to sense echoes 1,000,000 times weaker than the transmitted signal, a whisper returning from the sky. 4 amplifying stages gave it voice. The Doppler detection circuit compared transmitted and reflected frequencies, closing a contact when the shift signaled lethal proximity. Then came December 1941. The world changed. Pearl Harbor burned. The proximity fuse, once an important curiosity, became a matter of national survival. The U.S. Navy, long skeptical that electronics could survive the gun's brutal shock, no longer doubted. The devastation in Hawaii made the fuse project a top wartime priority. Funding exploded. Contracts leapt from millions to hundreds of millions of dollars. On March 10, 1942, the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, APL, was founded to centralize the effort. 5 major firms, Crossley Corporation of Cincinnati, RCA, Eastman Kodak, General Electric, and McQuay Norris, devoted entire factories to production. Before the war's end, more than 100 plants would join the network, each crafting some of the 130 precision components that went into a single fuse. The production goal was staggering, 40,000 units per day by late 1943, rising to 70,000 daily as the war neared its climax. Secrecy cloaked the entire enterprise. Workers assembling the delicate subunits had no idea what they were building. Each company handled only fragments, never the full design. The codename Variable Time Fuse was chosen precisely to mislead anyone who might stumble upon its existence. In military communications, it was known cryptically as POZIT. Even when unexploded fuses were later recovered in battle, both Japanese and German intelligence dismissed them as advanced time delay mechanisms. The true nature of the device remained hidden. August 12, 1942, Chesapeake Bay, Virginia. The cruiser, USS Cleveland, prepared for the moment of truth. 3 radio-controlled drones rose into the sky to simulate attacking aircraft. Cleveland's 5-inch batteries opened fire. In fewer than 10 rounds, all 3 drones were blasted from the air. Observers stood silent, awed. The Navy immediately canceled the rest of the 2-day test. It was no longer necessary. The verdict was clear. The proximity fuse worked. In earlier tests, it had taken an average of 2,500 shells with traditional fuses to bring down a single aircraft. Now, proximity-fused ammunition did the job with 25 times greater efficiency. By the autumn of 1942, production surged. The first combat-ready fuses were shipped to fleet units in October. Among the recipients was the USS Helena, issued 500 rounds of the new 5-inch proximity ammunition. To guard the secret, shells were distributed carefully, never all stored together. and sailors were strictly ordered to use them only over open water, where any dud would sink beyond recovery. Crews were trained in loading and firing, but not in how the mysterious fuses worked. Reactions ranged from disbelief to quiet fascination. Some thought it was magic. Others suspected it was luck. But on the morning of January 5, 1943, when Lieutenant Cochrane's gunners shot a Japanese dive bomber out of the sky without a single direct hit, the skepticism vanished. Word swept through the fleet like wildfire. At last, anti-aircraft gunners no longer fought the impossible equation of time and distance. They had a weapon that could think, or so it seemed, and the balance of the Pacific Air War began to tilt, one invisible signal at a time. By early 1943, the results were undeniable. Cruisers, destroyers, and battleships armed with the new proximity fuses reported kill ratios beyond anything ever recorded with traditional time-fused ammunition. Pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy sensed that something had changed, something invisible yet lethal, though they could not explain it. By March 1943, 1/4 of all anti-aircraft shells issued to the Pacific Fleet carried proximity fuses. That 25% of ammunition was responsible for over half of all Japanese aircraft destroyed by naval gunfire. Statistically, each proximity-fused shell was 3 times more effective than a conventional round. At night, against fast-moving aircraft, the advantage leapt to 7-fold. Imagine standing on a gun deck that once spewed endless walls of steel into the sky, hoping that a tiny fraction would connect. Now, with these intelligent shells, a handful of rounds could achieve what once demanded hundreds. The ocean itself seemed to tilt toward the Americans. Japanese commanders noticed too, though they did not yet grasp the cause. Allied intelligence observed abrupt tactical shifts that at the time were puzzling. Japanese bombers began attacking from higher altitudes, trading accuracy for survival. Torpedo bombers skimmed the waves, trying to exploit radio reflections from the sea that sometimes triggered premature detonations. Dive bombers steepened their attack angles to shorten their exposure. Each adaptation came at a cost. Bombs missed. Torpedoes failed. The carefully coordinated strikes that had once devastated Allied fleets now faltered against walls of invisible energy and precision fire. American gunners, emboldened, fought back with calm efficiency. Ship after ship reported success rates that made conventional air assaults unsustainable. Admiral William Bull Halsey himself credited the proximity fuse with altering the very balance of naval power in the Pacific. For Japanese torpedo bombers, the nightmare grew worse at night. Once, darkness had been their ally. Time fuses were useless without visual tracking. But with the marriage of radar and proximity fuses, American ships could now fight in total blackness, firing unseen and hitting unerringly. By the end of 1943, even though only 1/4 of all anti-aircraft shells used proximity fuses, those rounds were responsible for more than half of all enemy aircraft downed by naval gunfire. The weapon had become a silent partner to radar, together turning the night sky from sanctuary into slaughterhouse. Then came October 1944, and a new horror: the Philippines. Facing inevitable defeat, Japanese commanders unleashed a desperate strategy. Shimpu Tokubetsu Kogeki Tai, the Special Attack Units, or as the world would know them, the Kamikaze. Their first organized strikes came during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. It was not courage that birthed the tactic, but despair. After years of attrition, Japan's skilled aviators were gone. The replacements had barely enough training to take off, let alone execute complex bombing runs. But they didn't need precision anymore. A kamikaze pilot needed only to aim his plane and die well. For the Americans, this was a different kind of battle. The proximity fuse excelled against aircraft that attacked and fled. It detonated near enough to cripple or destroy before the bomb fell. But now there was no escape phase. Kamikaze pilots, aflame or shredded by shrapnel, still hurled their broken planes toward the target. Damaged or dying, they refused to veer off. The only solution was absolute destruction. A wall of fire so dense that nothing, not metal, not flesh, not faith, could pass through. The fleet adapted again. Ships increased their rates of fire, thickening the air with overlapping bursts of proximity fuse shells. Engagements began at longer ranges, the gunner's goal no longer to wound, but to erase. May 11th, 1945. Okinawa, the destroyer USS Hadley and the destroyer escort USS Evans stood as radar pickets, the first line of defense against waves of inbound suicide planes. In just 90 minutes, 156 Japanese aircraft descended upon them. Hadley shot down 12 before 4 burning kamikazes struck home. Evans destroyed 23 before damage forced her withdrawal. Both ships were torn and battered, yet both survived, a testament to the fuse's terrible precision. Post-action reports made it clear, without proximity fuses, neither vessel would have lasted half an hour. The statistics from the Pacific were unambiguous. Between October 1944 and August 1945, U.S. naval forces destroyed 238 Japanese aircraft using proximity-fused ammunition. Physicist Ralph Baldwin, in his authoritative analysis, calculated that under identical circumstances, only 46 would have been destroyed with conventional time fuses, a 6-to-1 advantage. Each ratio point represented not just mathematical efficiency, but lives, sailors who lived to see another sunrise, ships that stayed afloat to fight another day. At Okinawa, amid the fiercest kamikaze onslaught of the war, proximity fuses accounted for a massive share of enemy losses. The majority of kills still came from combat air patrols and close-range automatic weapons. But the fuse's contribution was undeniable. It had become the unseen shield of the fleet, a device born in secrecy, perfected in desperation, and proven in the crucible of survival. And so, with every explosion that tore through the Pacific sky, the proximity fuse whispered the same quiet message to history. That intelligence, the patient, relentless work of science, could stand between chaos and annihilation. June 12, 1944, northern France, fields that, for the moment, felt more like the edge of history than a map. While the proximity fuse was already remaking naval combat in the Pacific, an iron rule had kept it out of Europe. These fuses were forbidden over land because unexploded examples falling into enemy hands might be reverse engineered, but war has a way of forcing decisions. The V-1 terror campaign against London changed minds almost overnight. Beginning on June 13, 1944, Germany unleashed thousands of V-1 cruise missiles at England. At the campaign's peak, more than 120 a day. These pilotless rockets flew fast, low, and merciless, roughly 400 miles per hour and beneath 2,000 feet. Traditional anti-aircraft defenses, built for other wars, found them devilishly hard to hit. So the unthinkable happened. Churchill personally authorized the use of proximity fuses against V-1s, accepting the risk that some dud might fall into German hands. Modified fuses were hurried into production at Crossley Corporation and then flown across the Atlantic in special Lancaster bomber ferry missions. By mid-July 1944, British 3.7-inch and American 90mm anti-aircraft batteries were shooting proximity-fused rounds at incoming V-1s. The effect was immediate and dramatic. In the first week, kill rates jumped from 10% to 24%. By the fourth week, 7 to 9% of V-1s were destroyed by proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire. Picture a single day near the campaign's end when radar picked up 104 V-1s bearing down on England. Proximity guns splintered 68 of them. Pursuing fighters accounted for 32 more. Only 4 made it through to London. The city's salvation in many ways traced back to technology born on the other side of the Atlantic. Winter tightened its grip. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes, Belgium, the German offensive that would become the Battle of the Bulge, erupted through terrain long judged impassable to armor. Surprise and foul weather grounded Allied air support. American ground forces were caught in the vice. At Monschau, Colonel George Axelson, commanding the 406th Artillery Group, made an extraordinary, unauthorized choice. Confronted with massed German infantry and a collapsing front, he ordered his gunners to employ proximity fuses in ground combat, flouting standing prohibitions. He judged the emergency greater than the rules. 3 days later, on December 19, 1944, General Dwight Eisenhower formally requested permission to use the fuses on land. 2 days after that, December 21, 1944, all restrictions were lifted. The result was catastrophic for the Germans. Where conventional shells struck the frozen ground or sank into mud and detonated, sending most of their energy downward, proximity-fused rounds exploded 20 to 50 feet above the surface. The difference cannot be overstated. Airbursts showered lethal fragments across areas roughly 50 times larger than those of ground bursts. One shell's fragment pattern covered over 3,000 square feet compared to about 60 square feet for a conventional burst. German infantry advancing across open ground suddenly found themselves under an invisible carpet of death. Foxholes and shallow trenches offered little protection. The impact showed up in stark, almost obscene numbers. General George Patton, whose Third Army received priority access to proximity ammunition, recorded devastating results. On the night of December 25th, his artillery caught a German battalion trying to cross the Sauer River near Echternach. A single U.S. battalion firing proximity-fused shells counted 702 German dead. Patton wrote to the War Department with a mixture of blunt military astonishment and strategic foreboding. The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating. We caught a German battalion which was trying to get across the Sauer River with a battalion concentration and killed by actual count 702. I think that when all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new method of warfare. I am glad that you all thought of it first. Text as recorded. The fuse's impact extended from the snow of the Ardennes to the iron crossings of the Rhine. Between December 1944 and March 1945, proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells shot down over 1,000 German aircraft. When used as artillery, airburst-calibrated shells exacted grim tolls on ground forces. Radar-guided fire control made possible strikes on reverse slopes and even through forest canopy, places conventional indirect fire could not reach. In a grim irony, the Germans captured roughly 20,000 proximity fuses when they overran an American ammunition dump during the Bulge. Ordnance experts examined them and concluded they simply could not work as described. Electronics surviving the forces of artillery launch seemed beyond belief. Assuming the devices were some inscrutable form of time fuse, they warehoused the captured pieces and later abandoned them as the front collapsed. The secret, in part, was preserved not by locks and codes, but by the enemy's own disbelief. By March 1945, the fuse's versatility expanded further. On Iwo Jima, in the Bonin Islands, American forces preparing for the island assault faced dense belts of anti-aircraft and shore batteries. Engineers, modified VT fuses for use in aerial bombs. B-24 Liberators dropped these proximity-fused bombs on Japanese anti-aircraft positions in the hours before the Marines went ashore. The airbursts detonated just above the ground, catching gunners in the open and destroying equipment that near misses or ground bursts would have left intact. The results outstripped expectations. Positions that might have survived bombardment were rendered untenable, softening defenses and, in the cold calculus of assault, saving lives. Ask yourself, what do these chapters teach? That an idea first whispered in a laboratory can, with terrifying speed, become the arbiter of life and death on the battlefield. That technological secrecy can be as valuable as any fortification. And that sometimes, when rules collide with survival, commanders must choose the living over the tidy comfort of regulations. By August 1945, America had produced more than 22 million proximity fuses, a staggering industrial feat that cost over $1 billion in 1940s dollars. Each fuse was a miracle of miniaturization, 130 electronic components packed into a casing smaller than a man's hand. The project had swollen into a web of 87 firms and 110 factories, coordinated with the precision of an orchestra playing under wartime urgency. The manufacturing names read like a who's who of American industry. Crosley Corporation, RCA, Eastman Kodak, General Electric, and McQuay Norris served as prime contractors, supported by 2,000 suppliers crafting everything from hardened vacuum tubes to micro-sized batteries. At its zenith, U.S. factories turned out 70,000 fuses every single day. The cost per unit plummeted from $7.30 in 1942 to just $8 by 1945, a testament to scaling, ingenuity, and sheer national momentum. When the war ended, Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal offered a blunt assessment. The proximity fuse helped blaze the trail to Japan. Without its protection, he said, the Navy's westward march across the Pacific could not have been so swift, and the cost in men and ships would have been immeasurably greater. Admiral Arleigh Burke, who served as Chief of Staff to Admiral Mark Mitch's fast carrier task forces, remembered it even more vividly. By 1945, he said, all 5-inch ammunition was fitted with proximity fuses, and those fuses knocked down enemy planes by the dozens. The difference was measured not in statistics, but in ships that stayed afloat, in sailors who came home. Across the Atlantic, Winston Churchill added his own recognition. The American-made fuses, he noted, had proven potent against the V-1 rockets that assailed Britain. For once, the savior of London came not from Spitfires above, but from unseen circuits within artillery shells. The Japanese never understood what had happened. Post-war interrogations of their officers revealed a mix of bewilderment and misplaced theories. Some attributed the American success to superior radar or improved coordination between radar and gunfire control. A few engineers speculated about radio-controlled shells, but dismissed the idea as absurd. No electronic device, they believed, could possibly survive the shock of being fired from a gun. The notion that each shell might carry a tiny radar system was, to them, science fiction. That disbelief proved America's greatest ally. The proximity fuse remained secret until the war's end. The cost of that ignorance was terrible. Japanese naval aviation lost over 12,000 aircraft in combat during the war. Hundreds were destroyed directly by proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire. But the true loss was in human capital, the pilots. Every veteran killed represented years of training that Japan could not replace. By 1944, the pool of experienced aviators had been bled dry. The replacements, often barely trained, fell in droves to American defenses that no longer missed. By 1945, Japan's recourse to kamikaze attacks was not merely a cultural choice. It was technological desperation. Yet the story of the proximity fuse does not end with its wartime victories. Its legacy runs like a hidden current through the rest of the 20th century. The techniques pioneered to miniaturize electronics, harden components, and integrate sensors with autonomous circuits became the scaffolding of modern military and aerospace technology. From missile guidance systems to space exploration, from smart artillery to precision munitions that think before they strike, all trace their lineage to the same idea born in 1940, that a weapon could carry within it the means to perceive and decide. When Dr. Merrill Tuve returned to the Carnegie Institution after the war, he rarely spoke of what he'd done. When the story finally became public, he downplayed his role, crediting the hundreds of engineers and thousands of workers who had turned physics into production. But those who knew understood, without Tuve's stubborn faith that radio detection could be shrunk, hardened, and made practical, the proximity fuse would have remained an elegant impossibility. In its scope and consequence, the proximity fuse ranks beside radar and penicillin as one of the few technologies that truly altered the outcome of World War II. But unlike radar, developed in parallel across nations, the fuse was a singular achievement, the product of one country's will, to solve a problem no one else believed could be solved. To the soldiers and sailors who lived under its protection, it was simply the shell with the funny fuse. To history, it stands as proof that in war, sometimes the smallest device can make the largest difference, not through power, but through perception. Dr. Merrill Tuve and his colleagues in Section T did more than invent a weapon. They defined a new way to wage technological war. In less than 3 years, they identified the objective, charted the path, and delivered an operational system that changed the face of combat. Their disciplined, mission-focused approach became a template for the Cold War, echoed later in the Manhattan Project and in every major weapons development program that followed. Think of the pattern they set. University laboratories tackling theory, industrial giants transforming ideas into production, and military overseers uniting both under a single strategic aim. That model, born in a converted automobile dealership in Silver Spring, Maryland, would become the engine of 20th century military science. The legacy of those 20,000 G-rated fuses reached far beyond the battlefield. It reshaped how nations organized their scientific talent, how industries built precision electronics at scale, and how impossible technical problems yielded to focused effort, relentless iteration, and sufficient resources. By 1945, what had once seemed fantasy was now routine. Miniaturized vacuum tubes that engineers in 1940 swore could not exist were rolling off assembly lines by the thousands. The precision manufacturing that had required master technicians was being automated by evolving production methods. Yet, in 1943, 1944, and 1945, as Japanese bombers fell blazing into the Pacific, as German soldiers were torn apart beneath airbursts over the Ardennes, and as V-1 missiles disintegrated over the English Channel, the proximity fuse stood as the purest symbol of human ingenuity at its most formidable. Imagine that moment, January 5, 1943, above the Kula Gulf. Lieutenant Red Cochran, gripping the fire control director aboard the USS Helena, watched a Japanese Val bomber erupt in midair, destroyed not by luck, not by perfect aim, but by intelligence built into the shell itself. The fuse had sensed, calculated, and acted, all in the blink of an eye. For the first time, a weapon had made its own decision. In that flash over Guadalcanal, the world crossed an invisible line. The age of autonomous munitions, of weapons that could think just enough to act on their own, had begun. The story of the proximity fuse reminds us that victory is not always measured in destruction. Sometimes it is measured in demonstration, in proof that knowledge, not hatred, can tilt the scales of war. It was not propaganda that brought down enemy aircraft, but the prosperity of ideas, the disciplined application of the scientific method to the most brutal of human endeavors. Those who faced it never understood what struck them. Japanese pilots spoke of American gunnery so precise it seemed guided by spirits. German infantry told of shells that exploded as though they could see. What they encountered was not magic. It was the culmination of physics, engineering, and human imagination. The proximity fuse did not win the war alone. No invention could, but it shortened the struggle, saved thousands of lives, and rendered enemy offensives untenable. Each fuse, each tiny radar brain hardened to withstand 20,000 times the force of gravity, transformed artillery from a weapon of chance into one of certainty. And so, those small, unassuming devices remain a monument to what free societies can accomplish when curiosity, industry, and necessity converge. They prove that when science serves strategy, and when intellect is turned toward survival rather than conquest, innovation itself becomes the mightiest weapon of all.